Hello everyone, how are you going? Welcome to a military comparison between the United States and Canada. Who would win? Now I feel as though that's a little bit of a stretch. I feel as though everyone should know, or there's just a general consensus about who would win, but maybe Canada puts up a better fight than everyone thinks.
For millions of years, the northern half of North America has remained bonded together when other present continents were busy breaking off from the supercontinents of the past. Trade routes ran through both countries throughout the centuries, and still today the US and Canada, in terms of imports and exports, are heavily reliant on each other. Economic ties, the European influence, democratic governance, to some extent an intermingling of religion and culture, and of course English as the dominant language, make the two nations part of the same family. Nonetheless, as most Canadians and Americans will tell you, the two countries are also very different in many ways. One big difference is how the nations have developed in terms of defense. Today, we thought we'd compare them militarily. In this episode of the infographic show, the USA versus Canada.
Look, even though I can only imagine that we're about to go through every little spec and stat that these two countries have on offer, at the same time, I don't know if develop is the right word. Yes, they've developed together, but in terms of developing the military and then also the defense budget, one is shrinking and one is growing.
These two bordering nations each have a massive landmass, with Canada being the second biggest nation on Earth behind Russia. Canada's 3,855,100 square mile landmass, however, is not too much larger than fourth placed USA. America's landmass is 3,705,407 square miles, and of course China is the world's third largest nation.
Every time I see those two numbers compared to one another, I am blown away by how similar and how close they are. Like, it's what, 3 or 4% if you add it to 10 million Ks. I mean, of course there is a little bit of a difference when you start comparing the contiguous USA compared to the non-contiguous USA. You know, Alaska does add up to a sizable chunk that Canada just includes in its own, but I think it really just does come down to the fact that the projection on any standard world map is just so whack that it just makes Canada look so much bigger and Russia so much bigger than they really are. They're big, but not that big.
Given the size of these giant nations, you may not be surprised to hear the Canada-US border is the longest border in the world at 5,525 miles long. While there were disputes in the past over the demarcation of land in some border areas, as borders go, the USA-Canadian divide has seen few conflicts. The only time the two countries went head-to-head was in 1812, when Canada, as a colony of Great Britain, became embroiled in the latter's spat over USA expansionism. Since that time, the countries have been the best of allies. In fact, the necessity of safe trading routes and an amiable relationship allowed both countries to prosper. After China, Canada is America's biggest trading partner, while for Canada, the US is its main trading partner. The USA has a much bigger GDP than Canada, though, as we all know. Its 18 trillion plus GDP is the biggest in the world, whereas Canada's GDP is set to lie in 10th place on the list at $1.53 trillion.
Like I've said before, all things considered, I think Canada and Australia and so many other smaller countries, big physical countries but smaller population countries, do pretty darn well with what they've got. You know, they're not the biggest exporter to China. In Australia's case, we don't have all these rules about manufacturing cars and all those kind of industries, and we don't produce that much stuff, and so to be in the position that Canada and Australia, like I said, are, we definitely aren't doing too bad, especially if you look at the debt levels as well. You know, that is a completely different ratio.
The US is regarded as having the world's strongest military, and with a $611 billion defense budget, about 3.3% of the GDP, America outspends the rest of the world by a mile. Canada, a country not often exalted for its military prowess, spends around $15.5 billion on defense, which is around 1% of the GDP. This, however, will soon change. It was reported in June this year that Canada will increase military spending to $32.7 billion in the next 10 years. Canada's defense minister, Harjit Sajjan, was quoted as saying, "If we are serious about Canada's role in the world, then we have to be serious about funding our military."
Wow, I do believe I've heard that statistic before, but I've completely forgotten about how much it was, just going from 15.5 to 32 over the next 8 years, 7 years, whatever you want to call it, is a massive increase. To double? I mean, I guess you can certainly put it into perspective if you think about it, that once Canada does reach that 32 billion, and if the USA didn't move at all, the USA would still be over 20 times that, while only having even 10 times the population. But even though this is just the first image that came up when I searched it, you can absolutely understand how all of these countries that are stacked up on the left, China, India, the UK, Russia, France, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Japan, and South Korea, and I'm sure you could just fit on a smattering more, just all fit into the USA's budget. Like, it's insane. You look at the rest of the world leaders, and then you just got the world leader.
Now let's take a look at where all the money goes. The US has a population of 325 million people, 1.3 million of whom are active military personnel, and a further 811,000 acting as reserve personnel. By comparison, the Canadian military is minuscule, with 95,000 active frontline personnel and another 51,000 working as reserves. Canada's population is just over 35 million. Size does matter, and while the Canadian army is low in numbers, its special forces are said to be some of the most skilled soldiers in the world. In terms of land equipment, the US weapons cache of arms is almost unparalleled. The country has around 5,884 tanks, 41,000 armored fighting vehicles, 1,934 self-propelled guns, 1,299 towed artillery, and 1,331 multiple launch rocket systems.
Before you even need to, well, I guess we've seen a couple of frames, or maybe I've chopped it off, but before before we even hear anything about Canada, you can just know that that is just unparalleled. Just to hear 5,884 tanks, where do you store all of those? As I know that we already covered the fact that the USA is a big country, but you do have to fit 325 or maybe close to 350, 375 million people in that country at the same time, and they don't just go away, they don't get melted down. The old ones just kind of exist still, just out and about. I mean, to be honest, somehow the most simultaneously surprising and unsurprising thing at the same time is the fact that they have 2 million kind of active personnel. I mean, there is reserve, but I'm just going to lump them all in one boat, as I'm just trying to fathom how many people that truly would be. I mean, I can kind of understand how many 100,000 is, you know, if you go to a massive concert or a stadium full of people or something, that's about 100,000 people, but 2 million people is really difficult to try and just visualize. Like, if you had a stadium or a crowd, like, how far would that extend?
Canada has 80 tanks, 3,004 AFVs, 0 SPGs, 161 towed artillery, and 0 MLRSs. This somewhat meager arsenal, however, consists of mostly modern equipment. Canada's main battle tanks include a fleet of German-made Leopard 2A4s and Leopard 2A6s, some of the most advanced tanks ever created. Canada has also just been hailed as a great innovator of military equipment for developing what's been called a Terminator-like weapon. According to military analysts, the Canadian Defense Research and Development Organization has created the weapon of the future in its Soldier Integrated Precision Effects System, Supergun, or Smart Gun.
What did I just listen to? I mean, I know that Canada love their robotics in terms of the Canada arm and things like that, but say Titanfall anyone and then also show that and Terminator? Like, I feel as though Canada just need to step back for a second, just need to be arrowed for a second here.
Nonetheless, intelligent rifles might not be enough to hold back America's thousands of highly rated M1 Abrams battle tanks, a proven machine that has clocked a vast number of work hours. The USA is also spending big on developing its own super tank, the M1A2 SEP V3. The Royal Canadian Air Force is also somewhat outmatched in the skies when compared with the United States Air Force. Canada has a total of 414 military aircraft, 60 of which are fighters/interceptors, and 64 that are fixed-wing attack aircraft. The country has no attack helicopters. Its cream of the crop is its 103-strong fleet of American-made multi-role fighter, the McDonnell Douglas CF-18 Hornet. The Canadian government has also mulled over the purchase of the American F-35 stealth fighter, although that will come at some cost. Perhaps with the 70% increase in defense spending, Canada may have the aircraft in its sights.
That is interesting to hear that Canada weren't truly on board with the F-35, because Australia jumped straight on that. We're like, oh, we've got 40-year-old aircraft, we need to try and get some new ones. And as soon as, I mean, probably was like close to 10 years ago or something like that, but as soon as the government changed over, they just spent big and got as many as they could afford, which was only a minuscule amount compared to what the USA got, but that is what you get when you have 661 billion or 800 billion or $1 trillion, whatever they're up to now, compared to what we have, which is like the same as Canada. And speaking of Canada, it would be interesting to do a comparison between Australia and Canada, because I feel as though so many of these things would be quite shared, and just the ratio and the scales would tip one way or another, you know, as to have 60 fighters and 64 fixed-wing attack aircraft. I feel as though that probably outdoes Australia by a little bit, but barely if it does. And then 0 attack helicopters, I think we have 1 or 2, but I don't know.
The USA outguns any other air force and is pretty much spoiled for choice in terms of inventory. The US has around 13,444 aircraft, many of which are touted as the world's best. This includes legions of F-22A Raptors, F-16 Fighting Falcons, F-15E Strike Eagles, and the notoriously expensive F-35A Lightning II. The US also has a large fleet of the McDonnell Douglas CF-18 Hornets, some of which have been converted to FA-18E Super Hornets.
And that is where virtually every single other country, even if they combine a few of them together, gets absolutely dominated and stomped on. Just the fact that they have 13,500 aircraft. Like, you just block out the sun with aircraft, not even arrows. And for goodness sake, like I said, they make the aircraft that they use in-house. They're selling them off to their odd ally that they really trust. Like Australia gets a couple of F-35 Lightning IIs, and Canada, if they really wanted, I'm sure could get some too. But there is always going to be a few things that are reserved for US eyes only. And look, I completely understand it. I understand why the companies do it, because there's a massive budget that they can go chasing after, but really no one can compete when there is just that much on the table. To be honest though, it really starts to put that $600 billion+ budget into perspective, because if you have 13,500 aircraft and 2 million personnel, let alone all the tanks and everything else I've already mentioned, let alone the aircraft carriers that all those planes have to go on, you can really see how even just the maintenance costs of all of those things would just stack up so fast.
Canada's naval strength is rather small in comparison to the giant of the US Navy, although the Royal Canadian Navy has fought many battles over the years and is currently in the process of enlarging its fleet. The RCN consists of 0 aircraft carriers, 12 frigates, 12 coastal defense vessels, 4 patrol submarines, and 8 unarmed patrol training vessels. The US has 11 aircraft carriers, 22 cruisers, 67 destroyers, 8 frigates, 75 submarines, 0 corvettes, 9 amphibious assault ships, 11 mine warfare ships, and 55 patrol ships.
why would you even say 0 Corvettes? It's not like Canada had any to compare with, so why would you say 0 over there? You're just trying to fill out the screen or something? Because I feel as though with all those other numbers, even just starting off with the 11 aircraft carriers, you manage that well enough as is. You don't have to go in at a 0 in there. But no, when you do finally set eyes on these statistics, you just see the gap between these two countries, and honestly the USA and any country just widen and widen and widen, just continuously widen with this infinite budget, it feels like. I mean, for goodness sake, they have 11 mine warfare craft. Like, who else has mine warfare craft? I feel as though that's something out of Nemo. To be fair to Canada though, I have just noticed that they have more frigates than the USA does, which feels as though it's just an impossibility. Maybe the USA just sold all their frigates off because they had too many destroyers, they couldn't fit them all anymore. But the fact that Canada just wins one of these specs, I reckon they just win the whole war in my books.
As for nuclear capabilities, Canada does not have its own nuclear weapons, although it contributes to America's military programs. Canada is also protected under NATO's nuclear umbrella. The US, on the other hand, along with Russia, owns almost half of the world's 15,000 nuclear weapons. 1,800 of these weapons are currently deployed.
Hang on a second, what do you currently mean deployed nuclear warheads compared to nuclear warheads? I certainly hope that doesn't mean mid-air deployed. I mean, I guess this video was made 5 years ago, and so we do have a bit of a history or a catalogue, and we can just look back and go, okay, they weren't 1,800 nuclear warheads in the air, unless of course they're being carried upon planes or something like that. But I really would like to know, what do you mean, and what is the difference between nuclear warheads and deployed nuclear warheads? Please enlighten me. But either way, when you do see the numbers that are on the screen right now and you go, the USA has 6,800 nuclear warheads, and that is half of the world, with Russia having virtually the other half, you really do see that, maybe the rest of the other countries don't need to be given all this power. They don't need to be sprinkled among the entire world because there's too much at stake. There really is. Why would you want everyone to have them? And so it's always nice to see that countries aren't interested in them.
Superguns and weapons of mass destruction aside, these two countries share a long-lasting partnership when it comes to their defense strategies. The US and Canada are the only two countries outside of European nations that belong to NATO. Together, the two friendly neighbors have formed an alliance that combines one huge military force. This is recognized in official pacts, such as the Binational Organization, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the Combined Defense Plan, and even the sharing of military resources in times of natural disasters under the Canada-US Civil Assistance Plan. Besides the skirmish in 1812, the two countries have enjoyed arguably the most peaceful border relationship on the planet. Canada and the US are the closest of allies, culturally intertwined, and from an economic standpoint, reliant on their buoyant trading relation.
Well, I can't exactly say that I've ever heard the word buoyant be used to describe two countries and their friendship together, but to be honest, in this context, it does make sense, you know? It is light and fluffy, they get along well, everything just kind of works, it's such an equal and opposite reaction. Like he was saying, each military steps in where they're needed, and honestly, I would love to know the ratio, because obviously the USA is constantly in the news for being smashed by hurricanes and things like that, and that's a lot of what the military do in terms of what I know. And even though both the USA and Canada both got smashed by a supercell that came through just the other week, I wonder how often does the USA have to help Canada out, or is it just such a peaceful nation that they just never really do? They basically just steal their 100,000 people whenever they can. And so look, like I said at the start here, even though the title does say who would win, when you do see these kind of statistics and you go 414 compared to 13,440, like there's basically 13,000 more aircraft, let alone all the artillery and even just the personnel that are involved in all these different militaries. You can really see why Canada, and like I've said a million times, virtually every other country is just completely, literally outgunned compared to the USA. However, that certainly does not mean that Canada wouldn't put up their best fight. You know, we have plenty of examples of Canadians just going completely berserk, going absolutely against their nature, or that can be against the stereotype, I guess you would say. I mean, for goodness sake, he said it himself, the Canadian Special Forces are some of the most talented individuals in the world. And if nothing else, to take just one positive aspect out of all the negative world events that are happening at the moment, you really can see, and like I said, we're being shown examples of constantly, that a smaller country that is understaffed in terms of military, the way lower defense budget and all those kind of things, is putting up a pretty decent fight against one of the top dogs. And so even though the answer to the question who would win a war between these two countries is a very straight cut line, almost as straight as the 49th parallel, at the same time, these two countries have such an enduring friendship. Even though they had a bit of a scuffle a couple of hundred years ago, there's been virtually no blots in their entire track record, and I honestly don't see that changing anytime soon, so who knows, would they even fight each other? I doubt it. But anyway, in saying that, I reckon I'm going to call it there, so thank you for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, feel free to do the YouTube algorithmic things down below. Also, if this is the first video of mine that you are watching, then make sure to go check out any other ones I've done. Also, make sure to go check out the original video down in the description below, or hey, maybe even just want to consider subscribing so that you don't miss another one of these in the future. But all in all, have a good one, and see ya.